It's a great pleasure to be here as a Code Fellow and to be part of the organisation. It's an organisation that I joined a little while ago and had the pleasure almost immediately of, on the one hand, meeting Roger Mills while he was still with us, and also David Baume. Many of us in the room will have met and worked with David, and this next session is something of a appreciation of David's huge contribution to the work that has been done within Code and more broadly across the UK AG sector. So I'm going to invite Mary and Helen to join me. We are going to run a session that, along with Peter, who is online, conducting our online colleagues, and Andrew, who conducts everything, a session befitting of David, which will involve active learning, it will involve getting up, it will involve talking to people. It is very much on vogue for what David would have had us do. Mary, Helen, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining. I should point out also that this is a joint celebration of David's with SEDA as well, which David was an active member of, and Matt, who again is crucial to everything that we're doing, supports as well. So this is really a good opportunity to demonstrate how we're going to. David sadly passed away July last year. And as I said, he was passionately committed to staff and educational development. He really impacted many of us, and we were thinking about the most appropriate way to honour David's work. And we tried and thought about a number of different options, and hopefully this afternoon will do him justice. For David, before he passed, he'd been writing a book, tentatively called Please Stop Teaching. Now, many of us would contend that our job is to teach in some fashion. And so David's pre-obituary was very much a provocation for us. And we are going to work through a series of challenges that are on the tables in front of you to live out David's challenge. But wait, there's more. The work that David offered in his final words, his obituary, we are going to share with you and leave you with a particular challenge. So, Andrew, could you just move the slide, just so that everyone can see? So this was David's remarks in the SEDA newsletter, and he's going to use this obituary as an opportunity to learn from his mistakes. So, through a series of Please Stop Teaching quotes, now it's going through. We're going to provide an opportunity to work through, and we put these onto a bit of paper in front of you that's on each page. And we're going to offer up 20-25 minutes for discussion on each of your tables to react to this challenge. And it's born out of the fact that there is going to be, in the United Kingdom at least, as elsewhere in the world this year, an election. And a new, enhanced QA regime is our proposition is going to result from this election. And we are going to use David's manifesto to challenge and provoke to see what this regime may look like. Okay? So these extracts from David's book, we are going to use as, depending upon which table you're on, as sort of prompts, okay? In each of them, the scenario is the same. This new government, this new quality assurance regime, going to take up David's challenge, okay? The Baume Manifesto. Thank you. Okay? So this is our Please Stop Teaching. This is the bit of active learning that means that lovely lunch that the University of London serves doesn't sit too heavy in your stomach, and that you end up in a conversation, a dialogue. rather than a monologue, rather than I'm doing what David's telling me not to do. Okay? So I'm going to stop doing that and throw the floor over to yourselves. Your task, the National Office of Students, is not fully released text, so we have a chance to influence it. We can dream. Okay. Develop recommendations appropriate for your institutions, colleges, courses, programs as a response to the provocation you find. There's an online Padlet, which is an accompaniment to this, which gives our online colleagues the opportunity to contribute also. And we'll take it from there. I'm going to stop teaching. I think people are, if we can have people that move to friendly looking tables, which we all are, particularly if there's a code fellow who can coordinate across each table. So that requires perhaps some new colleagues, new conversations, okay? So this is the standing up, moving around, having a conversation with people we haven't spoken to previously, okay? Reconciling differences. All right, we're starting now. Let's run up to 1:30, okay?
We're really keen now to hear back your key thoughts. So many lively conversations there, some really interesting points. I just wanted to share a couple from myself that have been prompted by what you were saying when I was earwigging around. First thing for me is the importance of language. The concept of teaching, I think we all probably have slightly different ideas about what it means. For David and for many of us, teaching is sounds like a very didactic process. For others, they may think of something more student-centered as teaching, but that word has really strong connotations. And something for me, a personal bugbear I have, is the concept of delivery of teaching. And where that came from, I have no idea, but it's awful. It's even worse than teaching itself. And I'd love to see David's face if I mentioned delivery of teaching to him. But I think language is really important. So how else can we talk about this? Is it facilitating learning? Is it enabling? And there's lots of really good words coming out through your tables. And another one I picked up on, I think there's a table over here, had it as a bullet point, pedagogy of failure. And that's something I've been hearing quite a lot of in various forums recently, is really, if we want to learn, we've got to be able to safely fail, because you don't learn by doing things right all the time. So those are two kind of key points for me. But we have Simon and Mary around the room who are going to come around the tables. We might not have a chance to go to everybody, but we'll pick on a few to give us your feedback.
Thanks, Helen. So I will pick on people I know. So can I suggest people put up their hands who would like to report back on the very rich discussions that we were able to share in. I'm going to pick on Sam then, because she's nearest.
There's two things, pedagogy and bell hooks. Teaching to transgress, by the way.
Thank you. A couple of thoughts over here. Who would like to speak on?
Well, so we kind of picked up the number 10. So it's teaching hard or teaching easier versus assessment hard, assessment easier. So it depends on the subject. So one of the examples what we discussed was about the maths. So maths is such a fundamental subject. So you can't not teach it. So you have to kind of explain to students the basics, so whichever way you do it. So, and then how you measure whether students learn this math or not. So you have to assess it somehow. So, and traditionally it's always been exam. So to be honest, we couldn't kind of come up with any better idea to change it somehow. So what we're literally saying, it's subject dependent. So for some subjects, yes, maybe there is a bigger variety of changing the way how we teach or not teach and assess students, but the others, the fundamental ones, I'm afraid perhaps the traditional way is not that bad. Why to challenge them? So
I think that the maths example is really interesting, because that's been an analogy I've been pulling on recently, talking about generative AI and assessment. Because one thing I know in maths is you must always show you're working. Don't just give the answer, because you might get the final answer wrong, but if you've done the correct process, that's the important thing. So I think there's something we can really learn from how maths is taught and assessed in terms of assessing process, not just product. So I think there's different things we can think about learning in different subjects. So thank you.
On this side of the room, we had really entertaining and interesting and thought-provoking conversations. So I'm going to nab a few people with their permission. So I'm going to start here.
Talking about, it was the colleague here that raised the point that what's the difference between being taught and school, primary school, middle school, we're taught by teachers and we're taught to pass tests. But then when we come into the HE environment, a lot of us don't get taught how to learn in that respect. We don't just teach. Again, we're giving students the authority to learn, to explore, to pass on our passions and how to read around the subject. We're not just teaching them our knowledge, we're giving them the tools that they need to learn.
Use it. So that's a really, really key point. Thank you. Simon?
Okay. I think I've been given the mic.
Oh.
Okay. I'm going to just pull a few disparate thoughts without formal recommendations and take us into free jazz. So we had many conversations, including what's the point of universities and why assess as well within that 20 minutes, which is why we haven't come up with recommendations. But we did have this conversation around the facilitator and the space to develop learning and whether assessments encourage what you're anticipating you need to know as opposed to what you can learn as well. And I will actually come back to primary schools, and nurseries do this really well. They map skills over time. It requires the knowledge of their young people, but they demonstrate, and when they see things happening, they record it. So there are precedents out there in education. And we also talked about the interdisciplinary opportunities. So not watering down individual disciplines, but giving the space to go across disciplines as well, so that you get the breadth of understanding and the holistic learner and the opportunity for potential sparks of learning. And we didn't actually introduce ourselves, which is very rude, but you came up with this lovely idea of the facilitator as the conductor, which is where we went into free jazz, because we thought the conductor has knowledge, has that expert voice, and you do want somebody in the room that has that depth and that passion and that interest. But if you had a classical conductor, apologies to any classical musicians in here, there's rules and rigor. If you have free jazz, you can go off all pistes.
That's fabulous. And what I like about the jazz analogy as well is the idea of improvisation. And improvisation doesn't mean making it up. It means drawing on the skills and knowledge that you've already got, but playing with it and sharing it in a collaborative way. Yeah, so that's great. Thank you very much for that. There was a hand up over there, Simon.
Yeah, we threw around some different ideas, binning summative assessments, trying to avoid limiting people through measurement, finding interdisciplinary moments, but yeah, I just have to say I profoundly disagreed with almost everything that David said, and with you know, he was a lovely chap, but it really almost crystallized it. It distills down a lot of bad ideas into kind of one single piece, as far as I'm concerned. Sorry.
But the lovely thing is it's provoked discussion and conversation, which I think is the best part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you.
Thanks, Leonard. I knew you could do something like that. Anyway, right. So like probably half the room, it seems, we also thought that primary education might be the answer to all this, even going so far as to saying, should all HE teachers require primary teaching qualification, really to get a good grip on things like formative assessment and things like that. But in primary land, we talked about how, learning is measured in terms of expectations and levels, but is it a woolly assessment or is it very clean? They don't have exams in the same way. Well, not unless you count SATs, but you know who does. So there's also the idea of timetabled learning that in primary, some schools have, this is the time that you're going to be learning now, kids, and the rest of it's just fun, which gives an impression of something that's institutionally valued is then being taught. But what happens to all that social stuff that you do at primary school too, and all the other activities that you do, like creativity? So we jumped around a few ideas. Another one there was about what happens if you don't have the teacher as facilitator? What happens when you've got that greater self-direction? What happens on MOOCs? Do you just fall into the trap of videos and quizzes and hopefully something will sink in? But we got on to, well, if you're self-directed, you're going to be learning about something you care about, something that you're interested in. So what's the role of the teacher in that situation? And then who actually decides what is taught? We looked at professional standards, things that are common to a culture, what advances the discipline. So there's all sorts of various aspects to what teaching brings. But I think one of the more radical ideas was that actually we just go from primary to PhD and skip secondary and undergraduate and postgraduate. So there we are.
That sounds great fun. And talking of fun, I mean, there's quite a lot of networks and movements out there around creativity and play in higher education and gamification and so on. And I'm hoping that's going to take a bit of momentum because it seems to be picking up slowly, but I'm hearing kind of factions around the place of trying to, how can we bring more creativity and play? And I think that analogy with primary school is really interesting. The other thing that sprung to mind when you were saying that is, of course, we're very conscious that our students' time is increasingly pressed. Many of them have to work. They're full-time students and they're full-time working in some cases, or even part-time working takes up a lot of their time. Can we timetable those creative places that perhaps previously might have been extra or co-curricular? If we timetable them in and gave students permission to engage with that because it's in the timetable, what could we do with that kind of space? It could be quite interesting. Mary.
Okay, so we had a very interesting situation here because after we'd gone through all this discussion, we just learned that our friends, our colleagues from Indonesia are already doing this. So we thought that, what were we doing? We should have just allowed them to go for it. But some things that we picked, which I think have already been mentioned already, is I think David was asking us to generate some questions about what we think learning is all about. He was asking us to start a different kind of conversation about the role of a teacher, the role of a learner. And I think it's not really to say, throw out everything. It's about what kind of, thinking should we be having. So some of the things that we picked was the teacher as a facilitator of learning. So as a teacher, can you create an environment where students engaging from different places can actually engage with the learning at their own pace? Of course, it poses a challenge of assessment, but you as a teacher should be qualified enough to create that environment where the students can come in and actually pick out. So you are a facilitator of learning. The idea that learning only happens in this box, in the traditional setup, it's that classroom. So when the students come in the classroom, forget about where they come from, cut that off, forget that there are other environments around the box, and then, learning only happens there. We need to actually accept the fact that they are learning outside that box. We need to accept the fact that the teacher is not the sole owner of knowledge. There are other teachers. So we talked about the teacher as part of the community, the box as part of other boxes. So yeah, I don't know. Did I? Okay, thanks.
That's great. Thank you. And I think it can. Oh. Yeah, that'd be great. Are we able to hear that? Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
No, sorry, just extra technology. So so Ray was saying our group discussed whether the AI revolution is going to push us to make overdue innovations around teaching and assessment pedagogies in the same way the pandemic did. I think that's a really interesting question, and hearing different conversations, I think the answer is yes and no. I've been hearing some interesting ideas around assessment and how we can, we talked about process rather than product. different ways we can assess, because students now have this access to even more different ways of accessing knowledge. The other side of it is that we might just go back the other way and become very didactic, stick only to exams. Let's have them written exams, because that way they can't access technologies. This could go either way, which is, yeah, interesting in itself. So yeah, thanks for that comment, Ray.
We had similar conversations to, was it Oscar and the table about the things not happening in isolation. And the quote that really resonated for us was the idea of encouraging students to treat the whole world as a potential resource. And we thought that connected to the idea of connectivism, but was also linked to number 5 about the need to do away with a hierarchy between subjects. So we really wanted to I guess open up for co-creation and collaboration, and for students to be able to bring their perspectives, their experiences, their interests, their ideas of success, and different ways of thinking to the learning experience, which would mean we'd have to do away with a whole lot of institutional processes and constraints, or rethink some of them to enable us to open up the space to go into a unit or module with the idea that, okay, this is what we're working towards by the end of the learning experience. How we do that is something that we're going to negotiate between all of us. So it means questioning some of those hierarchies and power dynamics, and what is the role of the teacher in the first place.
It makes me feel that we need to move away from the idea that learning equates with a good performance. And if a student performs well, they have learned something. Because there are a lot of students who may actually been on a learning journey and made a lot of progress, but they may not end up with a high performance at the end, but they may have started at quite a low base and actually made quite a lot of progress. But at the moment, we don't have systems for capturing that. So there was talk about learning gain, and that never seemed to really take off. So I think if we're really going to look at process, we need to look at progress. And interestingly, the primary schools that have been mentioned, learning at primary schools, they do look at students' progress in, obviously, the basics, reading, writing, etc. It's much more progress focused. So I agree, primary school to PhD.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I wonder if I take a couple of the comments from the Padlet that we've seen here. So one that particularly resonates with me around everything in the world is connected, and this opportunity for interdisciplinary education is that our understanding complexity, that we might not come to answers as such, and therefore these things are very much more difficult to assess as a function of that. I think that's where we can perhaps resonate again with David's words. I think also we're in a situation where we're looking at how, from the comments that we made, how students are, in some senses, the student voice is coming through more in the digital version of this, which David, I think, would probably approve of. In what way is the facility, that even this Padlet, another bit of technology that we're familiar with to a greater or less extent, is shaping the dialogue that we're having? This version, the physical version in this space, in this 1930s design building, that, or this digital one, they're the same questions, but the emphasis, just reading them from my point of view, is slightly different in the way they've been addressed by colleagues of similar standing, experience, etc., etc. I wonder if there's anything else that anyone would like to add at this juncture. Is there anyone who got a burning point they'd like to make that we haven't quite got to? Peter, yes, if you're
that
try that, Peter.
Okay. Sorry about all the technical problems, folks. It worked great earlier. Anyway, I think there's some really interesting comments in the Padlets, most of which have come out of the discussion in your face-to-face. I think I think David got it wrong about primary schools personally, because I've seen quite a few very adventurous primary schools over the last few years with children, grandchildren, and what have you. One interesting question of that came out of the paddler, which I don't think has been covered directly, is what are we doing about assessment when the machines, i.e. the computers, can do so much of it already thanks to generative AI. And I think, to go back to Helen's point of earlier, that notion of what we do in future, there may well be different choices, and we may well see very different solutions emerging in different institutions, judging from what we've seen over the last 6 months. And the next year or two are going to be really, really interesting in terms of, because the technology is advancing so fast. We've been doing some workshops on generative AI, and we have to change the slides every week because something new appears on the horizon. So I think we are in for a very interesting few years, and it's just rather sad that David won't be here to see it and to comment on its development. I think the time is nearly up. So one final thought is we have to leave a few minutes space for Kit Power, who is David's son, to offer a few final comments. Thank you, Simon.
If I may, I did want to just come to our colleague over there very briefly, because kindly put your hand up, and then we'll come to Kit.
Well, actually, yeah, kind of in agreement with what you were saying, and kind of the pace the world is changing. We need to make sure that as educators, if you're going to connect with our experience and have a great experience doing our roles, and give our students a brilliant experience, it's all kind of connecting back to motivation. So what's their motivation for learning? What is it they want to learn? What is the output at the end of that? And making sure we're kind of giving them structures where they can go from knowledge acquisition through to understanding, application, and then being able to evaluate and critically analyze each other's thoughts and discussions with shape, with discourse coming from academic teams, coming from research-led teaching, but the importance of taking theoretical underpinning, reflecting against historical practices in our context within the industry, and then helping our students build those strategic recommendations for the future, whether that's a scholarly outputs or a managerial recommendation, but understanding why they want to learn and what that looks like, and treating them with a kind of co-created respect, that they're not coming as these, you know, to quote Freire, and sounds really cheesy, but these kind of empty vessels who know nothing, because that's not the case. Even at primary school level, 4 years old going to reception, those children have knowledge and experience to bring and have motivations of what they want to gain from school. So I think, yeah, the motivation for the student, for the staff member, for the institution, and aligning those feels like a really positive step. But we had good discussions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Kit.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'll try not to keep away from the coffee for too long. And I just want to start by thanking, you know, Helen, Mary, Simon, Linda, and Peter for your work in putting this together, an appropriately provocative workshop. And thank you also for the opportunity to speak now and say a few words about the man who inspired it. I should also apologise to anyone who was at SEDA conference last year. I don't know if it counts as plagiarism if you're copying your own work, but you will have heard some of this before. That's why I'm not an academic. But yeah, one of the many reasons. But yeah, apologies in advance. And a content warning, because I'm going to be talking about, there will be frank discussions around terminal cancer diagnosis. If that's something you would find upsetting or triggering, then please do exercise self-care as needed. You knew him as Dr. David Baume, a colleague, and perhaps also in many cases a friend. I knew him simply as Dad. I suspect most sons think that their fathers are brilliant, wise men, and I was certainly no exception. But in the weeks and months following his passing, reading through the outpouring of messages from his community, from you, I was forcibly struck by just how widely respected, admired, and I think enjoyed he was by so many of you. Maybe not Leonard, but many others of you. Fair enough, fair enough. We all liked him. Learning this after his passing has been something of a revelation for me, as well as an enormous gift and comfort. And on behalf of his whole family, I do thank you deeply for it. Speaking personally, another comfort that also had the quality of a revelation was learning during his last weeks, following an unexpected and devastating cancer diagnosis, that my father was also, in his own calm, thoughtful, considered way, a revolutionary, if not an outright anarchist. I'm referring, of course, to his final unfinished work, quotes from which inspired today's workshop. Please stop teaching. Now, to be clear, that work has a genesis that very much predates his diagnosis. I can remember him first telling me about the idea not long after we'd lost Carol in April 2022. And a quick check of his blog confirmed that as early as March of that year, he coined the phrase and was starting to publicly wrestle with the concept. I suspect, I hope, that keen observers of his work, perhaps someone in this room, will see threads of this thinking going back decades. I was with him when he received his diagnosis on the 30th of April. Bowel cancer that had spread to most major organs, up to and including several tumours on the brain. Those last, I was later informed, were considered to be the life-limiting factor. After the doctor had left the room and we'd sworn for a while, the first thing I said to him was, I need you to be selfish now. I need you to tell me what you want and we'll figure out how to do it. But I need you to be selfish. Now, that was a selfish demand on my part, to be clear, because I knew losing him was going to be hard. I mean, impossible, really, even though inevitable. And I knew the journey there wasn't likely to be much fun either. And I knew that I needed to be able to look myself in the eye afterwards and say that I'd done all I could for him. And over that first week, it became clear that this book was to be his focus. Now, I don't write academic texts about education, but I am a writer. And I think that helped me understand why finishing the book was so important to him. In the abstract, I can imagine having that brilliant idea and then feeling like you might not have time to finish. Ian Banks, a beloved author of both Dad and I, faced a similar situation when he was diagnosed with cancer not long after starting his final novel, The Quarry. However, for Dad, it was a whole other level. Why? Well, let me quote directly from the book, from one of, I think, 3 possible introductions, this one entitled A Misspent Life. I realize late in the day that I've spent much of my working life doing the wrong things. With this short book, I hope to make amends. I have always been a teacher, first briefly and horribly as a secondary school, grammar school maths teacher. The rest of the time I've worked in higher education. I taught irrelevant economics to justifiably bored engineering students. I did a much better job of teaching underwater engineering to thoroughly engaged, indeed immersed, students, mainly by getting them doing real underwater engineering. We built a diving tank in the lab and another much larger one in the car park. Alongside my wife, collaborator and best friend, Carol, I taught and managed on a remarkable independent studies program in which each student designed and undertook their own program of study, not by assembling a course from existing modules, but by actually individually designing and undertaking their own curriculum from scratch. Then, for more than 30 years, I've been training and qualifying university teachers and seeking to improve university education. What have I been doing wrong most of this time? Mostly, I have been teaching. He then goes on to offer a potted and characteristically robust history of his work in the field of educational development, including co-founding SEDA, rehearsing many of the arguments he'd later share in his self-penned obituary, which was mentioned earlier, so you can catch up on the argument there if you wish, sparing neither blushes nor brags as appropriate. The piece then continues. Yes, there is some humble boasting in this partial account of the partial professionalization of teaching in higher education and my roles in it. But my opening comment, where I realized late in the day that I've spent much of my working life doing the wrong thing, is serious and sincere. I have taught and then tried to improve, first and always my own teaching, and then others' teaching and teaching more widely. But I now feel this has been the wrong quest. Improving teaching, I now feel, is like trying to improve the internal combustion engine in the age of climate crisis. An interesting challenge, but even if you succeed, you're still ultimately contributing to a greater harm. You see what I mean about revolutionary intent, and you understand, I hope, both his passion and his urgency. That was the weight he felt in those last weeks. That was the sense of responsibility that drove him to work tirelessly, constantly, even as the illness took more and more of his facility, his capabilities. We worked hard, and long story short, at the end of the first week following his diagnosis, we had 11,000 words at what he called a good first draft status. And by the time he passed, in the early hours of the 5th of July, we had a manuscript still incomplete that ran over 50,000 words. I cannot fully put into words what a terrible, awesome, and wonderful privilege it was to work with him through this time, to be that close to an engine so powerful and so damaged. He worked so hard on the book. In fact, he never stopped. In his sleep, he'd say fragmentary things that clearly indicated his sleeping mind was not resting, but worked on. And following his passing, I had to take some time to grieve, to try and process, though in truth, I don't feel like I've gotten terribly far with either. And also to finish work as best I could on the manuscript, complete the commissioned edits, and continue to coordinate with those who kindly agreed to contribute chapters. That work has progressed well. And while I'm not in a position today to make an announcement, that would have been a bit too neat, wouldn't it? I am optimistic there will be positive news on that front, perhaps as soon as the next month or two. Please Stop Teaching was not intended to be a manifesto. Rather, Dad saw it as a provocation, the beginning of an argument, or yeah, sure, at his most ambitious, the opening shot of a new educational revolution. And he'd always been clear, and again, this predates the diagnosis, that it would be a work, a movement that would be unfinished, at least by him, that it would need others, his passionate community of learners, to take it forward. And so, here we are. Here you are. And here Dad is, with one final brilliant provocation for you all. When Carol passed last year, I had the privilege to speak at her life celebration event. As part of that, I expressed the thought that with 100 Carols, we could probably have changed the world irrevocably for the better. I further mused that it would be up to those of us who'd known her to carry that work forward in her absence, to try in our own imperfect way to be that army of Carols, I suppose. I still believe that. And I believe it of David too. Dr. David Baume, founding chair of SEDA, brilliant academic, fearless asker of questions, roller coaster enthusiast, Bruce Springsteen fan, photographer, composer, musician, author, loving and beloved husband and father. Thank you. Thank you for taking part in this event. By doing so, you are helping to keep the legacy of his work and his ideas alive and moving forward. I can think of no more fitting tribute to him, nor a legacy of which he would be more proud. Thanks for inviting me. And I'd like to close with one final passage from the man himself, again from the introduction. What should we be doing instead of teaching? We should be working together to help ourselves and each other to learn. Not separately from life and work, as mostly happens now, but as an integral, essential part of life, of living. If you want to be part of that working together, please email pleasestopteaching@gmail.com, and I'll make sure to keep you in the loop as the book project hopefully comes to fruition. And as we work on ways to build the community of learners and educational professionals needed to build on, develop, and progress these ideas. Because the work continues. Thank you for your time and the invitation to speak, and for your participation in this most fitting of tributes. Enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.
Very little to add. Let's enjoy David's memories and share them with each other over a cup of coffee, and we'll rejoin the conversation. Linda.
Just before we do that, I'd like to thank very much the panel and Kit for that. I worked very closely with David, and I find the whole thing quite moving. But I do have a book that David did finish. And I'd like to give our panel the book if they would be happy to receive it. And Peter will post your book to you. So thank you very much. Coffee to you across the road, and we start again at 3:30.